Picture this. One man's private intelligence network was faster than Napoleon's generals. While Europe's armies marched across battlefields, James Rothschild moved money across borders with surgical precision, accumulating wealth that would make Jeff Bezos look middle class. By 1825, the Rothschild fortune was estimated at over $5 billion in today's money, more than the combined treasuries of most European nations. But here's what nobody talks about in history class. James didn't just profit from war, he controlled it. When France teetered on the edge of complete financial collapse after Napoleon's defeat, it wasn't the government that saved the nation. It was one Jewish banker from Frankfurt who had been banned from his homeland for decades. The man who started as a refugee fleeing anti-Semitic laws would end up dictating the financial policies of kings. The same governments that had expelled his people would come crawling to his bank, begging for loans that only he could provide. James Rothschild didn't just accumulate wealth, he weaponized it. What most people don't know is how he did it. While other bankers played it safe, James built the world's first international intelligence network. His agents infiltrated royal courts, military headquarters, and trading floors across Europe. Information moved through his channels faster than official diplomatic pouches. When the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, James knew the outcome before the British government. This wasn't just about making money from war bonds. This was about controlling the flow of information itself, turning knowledge into the ultimate currency. James understood something that would reshape global finance forever. Whoever controls information controls everything. The scale was staggering. By the time he was done, the Rothschild banking empire stretched from London to Vienna, from Naples to St. Petersburg. 5 brothers, 5 capitals, one coordinated financial machine that could make or break governments with a single decision. This is the story of how a Jewish refugee became the most powerful financier in European history, and how he used that power to save the very nation whose wars had made him rich. Chapter 1. Exile begins. The stagecoach carrying James de Rothschild into Paris in October 1812 passed through streets filled with wounded soldiers returning from the disastrous Russian campaign. French newspapers still proclaimed Napoleon's victories, but James had received different information through the family's private intelligence network. His brother Nathan's agents in London reported massive French casualties. Austrian contacts confirmed that Napoleon had abandoned his army and fled Moscow in disguise. This information gap between public propaganda and private intelligence would become the foundation of James's fortune. While Parisians celebrated imaginary triumphs, he was already positioning the family banking network for France's inevitable financial crisis. James was 20 years old, the youngest of the 5 Rothschild brothers, and he carried with him more than just business credentials. Sewn into his coat lining were letters of credit worth 400,000 francs, equivalent to roughly $2 million today. Hidden in his luggage were gold coins from 6 different countries, chosen specifically because they would hold value regardless of which government controlled Paris. Most importantly, he carried detailed instructions from his father about how to establish the family's most audacious operation yet, a bank that would serve all sides in Europe's wars simultaneously. The Paris that James entered was a city of contradictions. Magnificent boulevards led to magnificent palaces, but the smell of bread riots lingered in working-class neighborhoods. Imperial guards paraded in gleaming uniforms, while government ministers secretly discussed massive debts. Napoleon's empire controlled territory from Spain to Poland, yet French treasury bonds were trading at 40% below face value, because investors suspected the emperor couldn't service his debts. James rented modest rooms in the Marais district, deliberately choosing a location near both the financial center and the Jewish quarter. This positioning was strategic, close enough to major banks and government offices to conduct business, but embedded in a community that understood survival under persecution. The Rothschild family had learned that success required being simultaneously visible and invisible, prominent enough to attract profitable clients, discreet enough to avoid dangerous attention. His first business meeting was with Gabriel Julien Ouvrard, Napoleon's primary financial contractor and one of the few bankers in Paris who understood international currency markets. Ouvrard controlled government contracts worth millions, But he faced a critical problem. Napoleon's armies needed payment in local currencies across dozens of occupied territories, and traditional banking methods were too slow and expensive for wartime conditions. James offered a solution that seemed impossible. The Rothschild network could transfer funds from Paris to armies in Poland, Austria, Spain, or Italy within 2 weeks, faster than official diplomatic pouches. They could provide local currency in any occupied territory without physically moving gold across battlefields. They could guarantee payment even if military situations changed dramatically. The method, an intricate system of promissory notes backed by the combined resources of all 5 Rothschild banks. Ouvrard was skeptical. How could a 20-year-old Jewish refugee guarantee financial operations that challenged the most established banking houses in Europe? James's response was to demonstrate the system in real time. He wrote a letter to his brother Nathan in London, requesting immediate payment of 50,000 francs to Ouvrard's agent in Amsterdam. Within 10 days, Ouvrard's man in Amsterdam received the funds, during a period when French and Dutch banks were barely communicating due to wartime disruptions. The demonstration convinced Ouvrard, but it also revealed something else. James wasn't just offering banking services. He was offering access to a financial network that transcended national boundaries, military conflicts, and political upheavals. For a government financing massive military operations across a continent, this capability was invaluable. The first major contract came in December 1812. Napoleon needed 2 million francs transferred to his forces retreating from Russia, but traditional banking routes through Germany and Poland had been disrupted by military action. James proposed an alternative. Rothschild agents in Vienna and Hamburg would provide immediate payment to French forces, while James received equivalent value in Paris government bonds. The transaction required no physical movement of gold, no vulnerable shipments across battlefields, and no dependence on cooperation between enemies. But James added a crucial innovation that would define Rothschild operations for decades. Instead of accepting payment in French currency alone, he negotiated for mixed payments, partly in French bonds, partly in gold, partly in Austrian currency, and partly in British pounds. This diversification meant that regardless of how the war ended, the Rothschild network would profit. The strategy was working, but it also created new dangers. French financial authorities began investigating how a recently arrived foreign banker could guarantee international payments that established French banks couldn't provide. Anti-Semitic newspapers questioned whether Jewish financiers could be trusted with French military funds. Military commanders complained that their payment schedules depended on decisions made by people they considered outsiders. James responded by making himself indispensable rather than invisible. When French generals needed emergency funding for unexpected military operations, he provided it immediately. When government ministers required discreet payments to maintain alliances, he handled the arrangements without questions. When Napoleon's family members wanted personal loans for lavish spending, James accommodated them with generous terms. Each service created dependency. French officials discovered that operations which once took months could be completed in weeks through Rothschild networks. Military commanders found that financial problems which had previously ended campaigns could be solved with a single conversation. Government ministers realized that diplomatic initiatives which required complex international financial arrangements could be implemented through one coordinated banking system. By early 1813, James's operation had evolved beyond simple currency exchange. He was providing intelligence about economic conditions across Europe, facilitating secret diplomatic payments between enemy governments, and coordinating complex financial instruments that allowed France to continue fighting even as traditional funding sources dried up. The transformation was remarkable. The refugee who had arrived in Paris 18 months earlier was now attending strategy meetings with Napoleon's finance ministers. The outsider, who had been viewed with suspicion, was now consulted about major government financial decisions. The 21-year-old banker was handling transactions worth more than the annual budgets of most European nations. But James understood something that his clients didn't yet realize. Every service he provided, every problem he solved, every dependency he created, was positioning the Rothschild network for the inevitable moment when Napoleon's empire would collapse. While he helped finance the French war effort, his brothers were simultaneously providing identical services to Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia. When the wars ended, the Rothschild family would be essential to all sides, and therefore safe from any side. The real genius wasn't in choosing the winning side. It was in making sure that whoever won would need Rothschild banks to finance the peace. Chapter 2. War Profits. By summer 1813, James had discovered the secret that would make the Rothschild family the wealthiest dynasty in European history. War was the most profitable business in the world, but only if you understood how to sell to everyone simultaneously. Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig in October 1813 created exactly the financial chaos James had been preparing for. As the emperor retreated toward France, pursued by a coalition of enemies, traditional banking systems collapsed under the strain of serving multiple conflicting governments. Austrian banks couldn't process payments to British allies. Prussian financial houses couldn't handle transactions with Russian partners. French banks certainly couldn't facilitate deals with any of Napoleon's enemies. The Rothschild network had no such limitations. Through careful political positioning, James had established the family banks as neutral financial intermediaries, institutions that could handle sensitive transactions between enemies because they weren't politically aligned with any single government. This neutrality wasn't accidental. It was the product of months of careful relationship building with all sides. James's breakthrough moment came when the coalition forces occupying eastern France needed an impossible financial arrangement. The Prussian army required immediate payment for their soldiers, but Prussia's treasury was exhausted. Britain had promised to provide funding, but British gold couldn't reach Prussian forces through military lines. Austria was willing to advance the money, but only if they received guarantees from London. Russia demanded payment in rubles, but no bank in occupied France could provide Russian currency. Traditional diplomacy would have required weeks of negotiations between capitals, formal treaties, complex approval processes, and vulnerable shipments of gold across contested territories. James offered a different solution. The Rothschild banks would immediately pay Prussian soldiers in local French currency, receive reimbursement from British accounts in London, provide Austrian guarantees through the Vienna branch, and handle Russian payments through St. Petersburg connections. The entire transaction could be completed in days rather than months. The coalition commanders were desperate enough to try anything, but they demanded proof that James could actually deliver on such an ambitious promise. His demonstration was audacious. He arranged for 500,000 francs to be paid to Prussian officers in Nancy, while simultaneously transferring equivalent value from London to Vienna and from Vienna to St. Petersburg. The payments were completed in 8 days, despite involving 4 different currencies, 3 different governments, and military zones controlled by enemy forces. Word of the successful transaction spread quickly through coalition headquarters. If one Jewish banker could solve financial problems that had paralyzed military operations, what else might the Rothschild network accomplish? Within weeks, James was handling payroll for British subsidies to German allies, facilitating Austrian loans to Italian resistance groups, and coordinating complex currency exchanges that allowed Russian forces to purchase supplies in occupied French territories. Each successful transaction generated massive profits, but more importantly, it established precedents. Coalition commanders began to assume that complex international payments could be handled through Rothschild banks. Diplomatic negotiations included provisions for financial arrangements that only the Rothschild network could execute. Military planning incorporated assumptions about funding availability that depended on James's continued cooperation. The scope of operations was staggering. By early 1814, James was processing over 20 million francs in international payments monthly, equivalent to roughly 100 million in today's money. His client list included British intelligence operatives funding resistance movements, Austrian generals financing local allies, Prussian commanders paying for military supplies, and Russian officials securing political support in occupied territories. But James's most profitable innovation was his approach to currency speculation. While other bankers reacted to political events, James anticipated them through the family intelligence network. When coalition forces approached Paris, he knew about it before French defenders. When Napoleon agreed to abdicate, James received the information before official announcements. When the Bourbon monarchy was restored, he had advance notice of personnel changes and policy shifts. This information advantage allowed James to position himself perfectly for each major political development. Before Napoleon's abdication was announced, he had already purchased massive quantities of British pounds and Austrian currency while selling French francs. Before the Bourbon restoration, he had acquired French government bonds at deeply discounted prices. Before coalition forces withdrew from France, he had established credit arrangements with returning French officials who would need international banking services. The profits were extraordinary, but they came with enormous risks. James was simultaneously handling financial arrangements for governments that were technically at war with each other. French royalist agents used Rothschild banks to receive British funding, while British intelligence services used the same banks to pay Austrian informants, while Austrian officials used Rothschild networks to coordinate with Prussian allies who were fighting on French soil. One mistake, one security breach, one political miscalculation could have resulted in James being arrested as a spy, executed as a traitor, or simply murdered by any of the forces operating in occupied France. The only protection was his value to all sides, and his ability to convince each client that their secrets were safe from their enemies. James managed this dangerous balancing act through a combination of careful compartmentalization and strategic transparency. Each government knew that he worked with their allies, but none knew the full extent of his operations with their enemies. British officials understood that James facilitated payments to Austrian forces, but didn't know about his arrangements with French royalists. Coalition commanders knew about his currency exchange services, but not about his intelligence-gathering activities. The key was providing each client with exactly the information they needed, while withholding everything they didn't need to know. When British agents asked about French royalist funding, James provided detailed reports about payments and recipients. When coalition generals inquired about local currency availability, he gave precise information about exchange rates and supply sources. When French officials wanted to understand coalition payment systems, he offered insights that were helpful but not comprehensive. This selective disclosure required extraordinary memory and organizational skills. James maintained detailed records of every transaction, but the records were coded to prevent any single document from revealing the full scope of operations. Client communications were written in language that appeared routine to outside observers, but conveyed precise meaning to intended recipients. Financial arrangements were structured to appear legitimate under multiple legal systems, while actually serving purposes that might violate various national laws. By the time Napoleon was finally defeated and exiled to Elba in April 1814, James had established the Rothschild banks as the only financial institution in Europe capable of handling complex international transactions involving multiple governments and currencies. Traditional banks were limited to single-country operations or simple bilateral arrangements. The Rothschild network could coordinate sophisticated multilateral financial instruments that served political, military, and commercial purposes simultaneously. The foundation was now in place for the next phase of James's strategy, using the family's wartime relationships to dominate European finance during peacetime. The governments that had relied on Rothschild services during crisis would discover that they needed those same services to manage reconstruction, debt payments, trade relationships, and economic development. War had been profitable, but peace would be even more lucrative, especially for the only banking network that all sides trusted to handle their most sensitive financial requirements. Chapter 3: Secret Networks. The Rothschild advantage wasn't just money, it was information. By 1814, James had built something unprecedented in European history, a private intelligence network that operated faster than government diplomatic services and more reliably than military communication systems. The network's foundation was deceptively simple. Each Rothschild brother employed dozens of agents who appeared to be ordinary business associates, currency traders, shipping clerks, customs officials, textile merchants, wine importers. These agents conducted legitimate commercial activities while gathering intelligence about political developments, military movements, economic conditions, and diplomatic negotiations. What made the system extraordinary was its coordination. Unlike government intelligence services, which focused on specific national interests, the Rothschild network collected information that served financial objectives. They didn't care about military secrets that had no economic implications, but they tracked every political development that might affect currency values, trade routes, government bond prices, or international payment systems. James's Paris operation became the network's nerve center for Western European intelligence. His agents included clerks in government ministries who copied financial documents, servants in aristocratic households who overheard diplomatic conversations, merchants who observed troop movements, bankers who learned about secret negotiations, and journalists who investigated political developments. The recruitment process was methodical. James identified individuals who had access to valuable information but limited economic opportunities. Government clerks earned modest salaries and could be motivated by discrete payments for routine reports. Domestic servants in political households were poorly paid and virtually invisible to their employers. Small merchants needed credit arrangements that Rothschild banks could provide in exchange for regular intelligence reports. Most targets didn't realize they were being recruited as intelligence sources. James presented the arrangements as legitimate business relationships. A government clerk might be hired as a consulting expert on ministry procedures, paid a monthly retainer for advice about bureaucratic processes that happened to include information about upcoming policy announcements. A merchant might receive favorable credit terms in exchange for market reports that included details about regional economic conditions and political developments. The intelligence flowed through multiple channels to prevent any single compromise from destroying the entire network. Written reports were embedded in routine business correspondence. Verbal intelligence was passed through social conversations at carefully selected locations. Urgent information was transmitted through coded messages that appeared to be commodity trading instructions. James's personal innovation was developing intelligence products that served multiple clients simultaneously. Instead of simply collecting raw information, he analyzed intelligence to create actionable reports for different audiences. The same information about coalition military movements could be packaged as a political assessment for French officials, a currency speculation guide for London bankers, and a trade route analysis for Austrian merchants. This approach allowed James to monetize intelligence multiple times while building relationships with diverse clients. French royalists paid for reports about coalition political intentions. British agents purchased assessments of French public opinion. Austrian diplomats bought analysis of Prussian negotiating positions. Each client received valuable information while James gathered intelligence about their own activities and priorities. The network's first major success came during the Congress of Vienna in 1814-1815. While European leaders publicly negotiated the post-Napoleonic political settlement, James's agents provided continuous reporting about secret meetings, private negotiations, personal conflicts, and hidden agendas. Traditional diplomatic intelligence was limited to formal communications between governments. The Rothschild network penetrated informal channels, servants in diplomatic residences, clerks handling confidential documents, merchants supplying conference facilities, bankers processing expense payments. James received detailed reports about which delegates were meeting privately, what concessions were being discussed behind closed doors, which governments were forming secret alliances, and how public positions differed from actual negotiating strategies. This intelligence advantage allowed James to anticipate political developments that would affect financial markets weeks before official announcements. When territorial agreements were reached in secret, he positioned himself to profit from currency movements that would follow public disclosure. When military alliance terms were negotiated privately, he prepared for changes in government funding requirements that would impact bond prices. The commercial value was enormous. European financial markets during this period were primitive compared to modern standards. Price information traveled slowly, transaction costs were high, and market predictions were based on limited data. James's intelligence network gave him unprecedented advantages in currency speculation, government bond trading, and international credit arrangements. But the network's real power lay in its ability to influence events rather than simply predict them. James discovered that information could be weaponized. Selective disclosure of intelligence could shape political negotiations. Strategic misinformation could manipulate financial markets, and coordinated reporting could influence public opinion. During the 100 Days Crisis, when Napoleon returned from Elba in March 1815, James demonstrated this capability. His network had advance intelligence about Napoleon's landing in France, but instead of immediately reporting it to coalition forces, James carefully managed the information release to maximize financial opportunities. First, he quietly sold large quantities of French government bonds while purchasing British and Austrian securities. Then he allowed selected intelligence to leak to coalition commanders, creating panic in European financial markets that drove French bond prices even lower. Finally, he provided complete intelligence reports to British and Austrian officials, establishing himself as their most valuable source, while positioning the family banks to profit from whatever political settlement emerged. The strategy required extraordinary timing and nerve. James had to balance multiple competing loyalties while managing information flows that could determine the outcome of major political events. Too much intelligence shared too quickly would diminish his value to clients. Too little intelligence shared too slowly would undermine his credibility. The wrong intelligence shared with the wrong people could result in exposure, arrest, or worse. James managed these risks through careful compartmentalization and strategic redundancy. No single agent knew the full scope of network operations. Multiple sources provided intelligence about critical developments to prevent dependency on any individual. Client relationships were structured to ensure that each government valued Rothschild services enough to protect James, even if they discovered his arrangements with their enemies. The network also included sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. James's agents monitored government investigations into his activities, tracked which officials suspected foreign banking operations, identified potential security threats, and reported on competing intelligence networks that might compromise Rothschild operations. This defensive intelligence was crucial because James was operating in an environment where foreign bankers faced constant suspicion. French nationalism created hostility toward German financial houses. Anti-Semitic sentiment generated suspicion of Jewish commercial activities. Coalition military governments were wary of international financial operations that might serve enemy interests. James survived these threats by making himself too valuable to eliminate. When French officials investigated his intelligence gathering, they discovered that his reports about coalition intentions were helping France negotiate better terms. When coalition commanders questioned his loyalty, they found that his financial services were essential to their military operations. When rival banking houses tried to undermine his operations, they realized that they couldn't provide the same international capabilities. By the time the Congress of Vienna concluded in June 1815, James had established the Rothschild banks as the primary source of both financial services and political intelligence for European governments. Traditional boundaries between banking and intelligence, between commercial activities and political operations, between national loyalties and international business had been permanently blurred. The intelligence network that James built during this period would continue operating for decades, providing the foundation for Rothschild financial dominance across Europe. Governments that relied on Rothschild information during wartime discovered that they needed the same intelligence services during peacetime. Political leaders who had used Rothschild banks for sensitive transactions continued to depend on those services for routine operations. Information had become the Rothschilds' most valuable commodity, more precious than gold, more powerful than military force, more durable than political authority. Chapter 4. Napoleon's Banker. March 1815 brought the crisis that would define James Rothschild's legacy. Napoleon Bonaparte had escaped from Elba and was marching toward Paris, gathering supporters who believed the emperor could restore French glory. Europe faced the possibility of renewed continental war, just as the coalition forces were demobilizing their armies and shifting resources toward peaceful reconstruction. For most European bankers, Napoleon's return represented unacceptable risk. Government bonds collapsed as investors fled to safer assets. International trade ground to a halt as merchants cancelled contracts that depended on political stability. Traditional banking houses retreated to defensive positions, protecting existing assets rather than pursuing new opportunities. James saw something different, the greatest financial opportunity in European history. While other bankers panicked, he recognized that Napoleon's return created extraordinary demand for exactly the services that only the Rothschild network could provide. Both sides in the inevitable conflict would need rapid access to international funding, currency exchange services, and intelligence about enemy capabilities. The challenge was positioning himself to serve both sides simultaneously without appearing to betray either. Traditional neutrality wouldn't work. The political stakes were too high for governments to accept genuinely neutral partners. Instead, James needed to convince each side that he was their committed ally while secretly serving their enemies. His solution was masterfully duplicitous. To Napoleon's government, James presented himself as a French banker who had been building international capabilities to serve French interests. His network of agents could provide intelligence about coalition activities. His relationships with foreign banks could facilitate French government borrowing. His currency expertise could help France finance military operations across Europe. To coalition forces, James portrayed himself as an international banker who happened to operate in Paris but remained loyal to broader European interests. His intelligence network could monitor French military preparations. His financial services could help coalition governments coordinate funding for military operations. His local knowledge could assist occupation forces if they captured French territory. Both presentations were technically accurate, but neither revealed the full picture. James was indeed building international capabilities that could serve French interests, and he was simultaneously developing services that would benefit coalition forces. He was gathering intelligence about coalition activities that he shared with French officials, while providing intelligence about French activities to coalition commanders. The deception required extraordinary operational security. James maintained separate sets of books, separate communication channels, separate agent networks, and separate client relationships for each side. French officials who visited his offices saw evidence of the French banking operation, but not the coalition intelligence reports. Coalition agents who met with James received detailed briefings about French activities, but didn't learn about his services to Napoleon's government. Napoleon's return to Paris on March 20, 1815, created immediate financial emergencies that tested James's capabilities. The emperor needed funding to rebuild his army, but traditional French banks were reluctant to lend money to a government that might not survive the inevitable coalition response. Foreign banks were completely unwilling to provide credit to Napoleon after his previous military disasters. James offered Napoleon something no other banker could provide: immediate access to international capital markets through the Rothschild network. French government bonds might be worthless on Paris exchanges, but James could convert them to Austrian currency through the Vienna branch, exchange Austrian currency for British pounds through London operations, and use British capital to purchase military supplies from neutral merchants. The transactions were complex and expensive. James charged substantial fees for assuming the enormous risks involved, but they provided Napoleon with financial resources that would otherwise have been unavailable. Within days of returning to power, the emperor had access to funding that allowed him to pay soldiers, purchase weapons, and begin mobilizing for renewed military campaigns. But James was simultaneously providing equivalent services to Napoleon's enemies. Coalition commanders needed intelligence about French military preparations, currency exchange services for international payments, and financial arrangements to coordinate their response. The Rothschild network delivered all three while carefully concealing the fact that they were also serving French interests. The intelligence James provided to coalition forces was particularly valuable because it came from sources inside Napoleon's government. French military planning, resource assessments, diplomatic initiatives, and strategic decisions were being reported to coalition headquarters almost as quickly as they were being communicated to French commanders. Napoleon's government never suspected that their trusted banker was simultaneously serving their enemies, because James was providing genuinely valuable services to French interests. His intelligence reports about coalition activities helped French diplomats understand enemy intentions. His financial services enabled French military operations that wouldn't have been possible through traditional banking channels. His political assessments helped Napoleon's advisors develop strategies for managing the crisis. The arrangement was profitable for everyone except the soldiers, who would die fighting battles that might have been avoided if either side had complete information about their enemy's capabilities and intentions. James was collecting fees from French government, borrowing while earning commissions on coalition financial arrangements. He was being paid to provide intelligence to French officials while receiving separate payments for delivering intelligence to coalition commanders. The ethical implications were staggering. James was facilitating military operations on both sides of a conflict that would kill hundreds of thousands of people. He was providing financial services that enabled armies to fight longer and more effectively. He was delivering intelligence that helped both sides plan more destructive military campaigns. Yet from James's perspective, the arrangement was defensible on multiple levels. First, he wasn't determining which side would win. He was simply providing financial services that both sides needed regardless of the conflict's outcome. Second, he wasn't creating the military conflict. He was responding to demand for banking services that existed because political leaders had chosen to resolve their disputes through warfare. Third, he was actually reducing the conflict's duration and intensity by ensuring that both sides had access to accurate information about their enemy's capabilities. The most morally complex aspect of James's operations was his impact on military planning. Coalition commanders who received detailed intelligence about French preparations could develop more effective strategies for defeating Napoleon's forces. French officials who learned about coalition capabilities could make better decisions about whether continued resistance was realistic. In theory, this mutual transparency should have shortened the conflict by helping both sides understand the military realities they faced. In practice, the intelligence sometimes enabled both sides to fight more effectively, prolonging battles that might have ended quickly if one side had overwhelming advantages. James navigated these ethical complexities by focusing on financial rather than political objectives. He wasn't trying to determine which government controlled Europe. He was building a banking network that could serve whoever ultimately won. He wasn't attempting to influence military outcomes. He was positioning himself to profit from whatever political settlement emerged from the conflict. This approach required James to maintain emotional detachment from events that were reshaping European civilization. While others celebrated victories or mourned defeats, he analyzed each development in terms of its impact on financial markets and banking opportunities. While others formed passionate loyalties to political causes, he maintained professional relationships with clients regardless of their ideological commitments. The strategy was tested when Napoleon's army approached the decisive confrontation that everyone knew would determine the emperor's fate. European financial markets were paralyzed by uncertainty about the outcome. Traditional banking operations had virtually ceased as investors awaited news that could make or break governments. James prepared for what he knew would be the most important financial opportunity in European history. The battle that ended Napoleon's career would also determine which banking network would dominate European finance for the next generation. Chapter 5. Information Empire. June 15, 1815. While European armies converged on Belgium for the battle that would determine Napoleon's fate, James Rothschild was implementing the most audacious intelligence operation in financial history. The Rothschild courier network was about to deliver information that would generate profits exceeding the annual budgets of most European nations. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. James had positioned agents throughout the battle zone, not to influence military outcomes, but to observe and report results immediately. The moment decisive action occurred, Rothschild couriers would carry news toward London faster than any government communication system. James's brother Nathan would receive battle results before British government officials, before stock exchange operators, before newspaper publishers, before anyone else who might trade on the information. Traditional communication between continental Europe and Britain required several days under the best conditions. Official dispatches traveled through military channels that prioritized security over speed. Commercial messages used regular postal services that moved at civilian pace. The Rothschild network had spent months developing alternative routes that sacrificed nothing for velocity. James's masterstroke was recruiting agents who could penetrate military zones that were forbidden to civilian observers. These weren't traditional spies seeking military secrets. They were intelligence specialists gathering information that had enormous commercial value but no strategic military significance. Knowing which army won a battle didn't help the losing side fight more effectively, but it could generate massive profits for investors who positioned themselves correctly before the information became public. The courier system James designed for the Waterloo operation demonstrated the sophisticated logistics that the Rothschild network had developed over 3 years of wartime operations. Primary couriers carried official reports through the fastest possible routes. Secondary couriers followed alternate paths in case primary routes were blocked by military action. Emergency couriers were positioned at intermediate points to ensure message transmission, even if primary and secondary systems failed. Each courier carried multiple copies of essential information in different forms. Written reports provided detailed accounts of battle developments. Coded messages conveyed crucial facts in formats that could be transmitted quickly, even if detailed reports were lost. Verbal summaries allowed couriers to relay critical information even if all written materials were seized by military authorities. The network's sophistication extended beyond simple message transmission. James had established relay stations where couriers could change horses, rest briefly, and transfer messages to fresh riders without losing momentum. These stations were disguised as routine commercial facilities, inns, trading posts, customs houses, that appeared legitimate to casual observers, but were actually components of an integrated intelligence system. The investment in this infrastructure was enormous. James estimated that the Waterloo intelligence operation cost over 200,000 francs to implement, equivalent to roughly $1 million in today's money. Traditional banking houses would never have justified such expenses for uncertain returns. But James understood that information could be more valuable than any physical commodity if it was delivered to the right people at the right time. On June 18, 1815, as Wellington's forces engaged Napoleon at Waterloo, James's agents were positioned throughout the battlefield zone. They observed not just the major battle, but subsidiary actions that might affect the outcome. Prussian movements that could reinforce Wellington, French reserve deployments that might change the balance, supply issues that could determine which army could sustain fighting longest. The battle's outcome became clear by late afternoon. Napoleon's final cavalry charge had failed. French forces were retreating in disorder. Wellington and Blucher had achieved decisive victory. The emperor's political career was finished, and his supporters would face military occupation by coalition forces. James's primary courier, a professional horseman named Rothworth, left the battlefield at 6 p.m. with complete intelligence about the French defeat. He rode toward Ostend, through routes that James's agents had scouted weeks earlier, changing horses at Rothschild stations that were prepared to support maximum speed travel toward British ports. The journey that normally required 2 days was completed in 18 hours. Rothworth reached Ostend on June 19th at noon, carrying information that wouldn't reach London through official channels for at least another day. A Rothschild boat was waiting at the harbour, crewed by sailors who understood that speed was worth any expense. Weather conditions were perfect for channel crossing, and the Rothschild boat reached Dover in 4 hours. Nathan Rothschild received detailed intelligence about Napoleon's defeat at 8 p.m. on June 19th, more than 24 hours before government officials would learn the battle's outcome. But Nathan's genius lay in how he used this intelligence advantage. Instead of immediately buying British government bonds, which would signal his knowledge to other market participants, he began the trading day on June 20th by selling large quantities of British securities. Other traders, assuming that Nathan had received bad news about Wellington's campaign, followed his lead and began selling British investments. British bond prices collapsed as panic spread through London financial markets. Investors who had supported the war effort against Napoleon saw their holdings lose 20%, then 30%, then 40% of their value in a matter of hours. The selling momentum became self-reinforcing as traders tried to minimize losses by liquidating positions before prices fell further. Nathan allowed the panic to build throughout the morning, selling enough British securities to maintain downward price pressure while secretly instructing agents to purchase massive quantities of discounted bonds through intermediaries who couldn't be traced to Rothschild operations. By noon, when the selling panic had reached maximum intensity, Nathan had accumulated British government debt with a face value exceeding 20 million, equivalent to roughly $2 billion today. At 2 p.m., official news of Wellington's victory reached London through government channels. British bond prices exploded upward as investors realized that their panic selling had been based on false assumptions. Traders who had sold British securities in the morning tried to repurchase them in the afternoon, driving prices to levels higher than before the panic began. Nathan's profit was estimated at over $1 million, equivalent to approximately $100 million in today's money, generated in a single day through superior intelligence and market manipulation. But the financial impact extended far beyond immediate trading gains. The Rothschild network had demonstrated capabilities that no other banking house could match: information delivery systems that surpassed government communications, market influence that could move prices independently of fundamental values, and coordination between different national markets that allowed profits to be extracted from temporary price discrepancies. More importantly, the Waterloo operation established the Rothschild banks as the only financial institution in Europe with reliable access to information that could determine market outcomes. Government officials who needed intelligence about political developments, military commanders who required information about enemy activities, and investors who wanted advanced knowledge about events that could affect their holdings, all discovered that the Rothschild network provided intelligence services that were faster, more reliable, and more comprehensive than any alternative. James's Paris operation became the clearinghouse for this intelligence empire. Information flowed into Paris from Rothschild agents across Europe, was analyzed and packaged for different clients, and was distributed through channels that served both commercial and political purposes. French officials received intelligence about coalition activities that helped them understand international developments. Coalition commanders got information about French political conditions that assisted their occupation planning. Investors purchased market analysis that incorporated political intelligence unavailable through other sources. The revenues from these intelligence services often exceeded profits from traditional banking operations. Governments paid substantial fees for information that helped them make better policy decisions. Military commanders compensated the Rothschild network for intelligence that improved their operational effectiveness. Investors who received advance information about political developments that would affect financial markets were willing to pay premium prices for such valuable services. By the end of 1815, James had transformed the family banking network into something unprecedented in European history, a financial institution that derived as much value from information as from capital. Traditional banks made money by lending funds at higher interest rates than they paid depositors. The Rothschild network generated profits by monetizing intelligence that other institutions couldn't collect, analyze, or distribute. Information had become the family's primary competitive advantage, and James was positioned to dominate European finance through superior knowledge rather than superior capital alone. Chapter 6. Waterloo Victory. The morning of June 21, 1815, changed European finance forever. As news of Wellington's decisive victory at Waterloo spread through London markets, Nathan Rothschild controlled $20 million in British government securities purchased at panic-induced discount prices just hours before their value soared. But the Waterloo windfall was just the beginning of a financial operation that would establish the Rothschild family as the dominant force in European banking for the next century. James's intelligence network had delivered more than just battle results. His agents provided comprehensive analysis of the political implications that other investors were still struggling to understand. Napoleon's defeat meant that coalition governments would survive and their debt obligations would be honored. French resistance to occupation would be minimal because Napoleon had fled rather than dying heroically in battle. European trade routes would reopen immediately because no significant French forces remained to threaten commercial shipping. Most importantly, James understood that post-war reconstruction would require massive international funding that traditional banking houses couldn't provide. European governments needed loans to pay coalition armies, rebuild damaged infrastructure, establish new political institutions, and manage the economic transition from wartime to peacetime production. The scale of these requirements exceeded the capacity of single-country banks, but the Rothschild network could coordinate international financial arrangements that served multiple governments simultaneously. The opportunity was enormous, but it required James to reposition his operations quickly. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschild banks had profited by serving all sides in ongoing conflicts. Now they needed to transform into peacetime institutions that could finance reconstruction, while maintaining the political relationships that had been built during wartime. James's strategy was to make the Rothschild network indispensable to the new European political order. Instead of simply providing financial services to governments that requested them, he would anticipate funding requirements and offer solutions before problems became crises. Instead of competing with traditional banks for routine business, he would focus on complex international transactions that other institutions couldn't handle. The first major test came in July 1815, when coalition forces occupying France demanded immediate payment of war reparations totaling 700 million francs, equivalent to approximately $3.5 billion in today's money. The amount exceeded France's annual government revenues and couldn't be paid through traditional taxation or domestic borrowing. French officials needed international financial arrangements that could provide immediate funding while allowing extended repayment terms. Traditional banks couldn't handle a transaction of this magnitude. British financial houses lacked sufficient capital and had no presence in French markets. German banks were too small and politically unreliable. Austrian and Prussian institutions could provide some funding but not the full amount, and not with the speed that coalition governments demanded. James proposed an alternative. The Rothschild network would coordinate the entire reparations payment through a complex international loan arrangement. French government bonds would be issued simultaneously in London, Vienna, Berlin, and Frankfurt markets. Each Rothschild bank would purchase bonds in their local currency, but the network would coordinate pricing to ensure that France received maximum value while investors in different countries received appropriate returns for their risk. The innovation wasn't just in the scale of the operation, but in its structure. Instead of a single large loan that created dangerous concentration of risk, James designed multiple smaller loans with different terms, different currencies, and different repayment schedules. If economic conditions changed in any single country, the other components of the arrangement could compensate. If political developments affected any particular government's ability to honor their commitments, alternative funding sources could maintain the overall structure. Coalition governments were initially skeptical that any private banking network could handle such massive financial requirements. James demonstrated the system's capabilities by arranging a preliminary transaction of 50 million francs within 2 weeks. Faster than traditional diplomatic negotiations could have established the framework for government-to-government loans. The reparations arrangement established the Rothschild network as the primary financial intermediary for post-war European reconstruction. Governments that had relied on Rothschild services during wartime discovered that they needed the same capabilities during peacetime. Military commanders who had used Rothschild intelligence during campaigns found that they required similar information for occupation administration. Political leaders who had depended on Rothschild coordination during crises realized that they needed those services for routine governance. But James's most significant innovation was his approach to government bond markets. Traditional government borrowing was limited to domestic investors who could evaluate local political conditions and currency risks. International government bonds were rare, because foreign investors lacked reliable information about political stability, economic conditions, and government debt service capabilities. The Rothschild network solved these problems by creating the world's first international market for government securities. Their intelligence network could evaluate political risks in any European country. Their coordinated operations could handle currency conversions and international payments. Their relationships with multiple governments provided credible guarantees that loan terms would be honored even if political conditions changed. James established standardized procedures for evaluating government loan applications that became the foundation for modern credit analysis. Applicant governments had to provide detailed information about their revenues, expenditures, debt obligations, military requirements, and political stability. Rothschild agents would investigate these claims through independent sources. Terms would be structured to reflect actual risk levels rather than diplomatic considerations. This systematic approach allowed the Rothschild network to price government loans more accurately than traditional banks, which often made lending decisions based on political relationships rather than financial analysis. Governments with strong finances could borrow at favorable rates through Rothschild markets. Governments with questionable credit would pay higher interest rates that reflected their actual risk levels. The pricing precision created enormous competitive advantages. Rothschild banks could offer better terms to creditworthy governments while avoiding losses on loans to unreliable borrowers. Traditional banks that couldn't analyze credit risks as effectively either lost profitable business to Rothschild competition or lost money on loans to governments that defaulted. James's government bond operations also generated substantial intelligence value beyond their direct financial returns. Government loan applications revealed detailed information about national finances, political conditions, military capabilities, and economic development plans that couldn't be obtained through other sources. This intelligence helped the Rothschild network make better investment decisions while providing valuable information that could be sold to other clients. By 1816, the Rothschild banks were handling government borrowing for Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and multiple smaller European states. The network's market share in international government finance exceeded 60%, a level of dominance that no financial institution had ever achieved across multiple national markets. The profits were staggering. James estimated that the family's annual income from government bond operations exceeded 10 million francs, equivalent to roughly 50 million in today's money. But more importantly, the operations established the Rothschild network as the central mechanism through which European governments financed their most important activities. Government officials who needed funding for major projects consulted Rothschild banks about market conditions and loan structures. Political leaders who were considering policy changes that might affect their creditworthiness sought Rothschild advice about financial implications. Diplomatic negotiations that involved economic components included Rothschild representatives who could evaluate financial feasibility. The network had achieved something unprecedented in European history: a private financial institution that influenced government policy through its control over international credit markets. Political leaders might command armies and make laws, but they needed Rothschild approval to finance their most ambitious initiatives. James was no longer just a banker. He was a financial statesman whose decisions could determine whether governments succeeded or failed in their most important objectives. The Jewish refugee who had arrived in Paris during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow had become one of the most powerful individuals in post-Napoleonic Europe. But the greatest opportunities still lay ahead as James prepared to use his financial influence to reshape European economic development through the emerging Industrial Revolution. Chapter 7. French Salvation. By 1817, France faced a financial crisis that threatened to destroy the restored Bourbon monarchy and potentially trigger another European war. The country owed massive reparations to coalition forces, government revenues were insufficient to service existing debts, and traditional French banks lacked the capital to provide adequate funding for economic reconstruction. King Louis XVIII and his ministers discovered that their nation's survival depended on the willingness of one Jewish banker to continue providing international financial support. The crisis had been building since Napoleon's final defeat. Coalition occupation forces demanded not just the 700 million franc reparations that James had arranged, but additional payments for ongoing military expenses, infrastructure repairs, and political reorganization costs. French government debt had increased from 1.2 billion francs in 1814 to over 2.8 billion francs by 1817, equivalent to roughly $14 billion in today's money. Worse, France's credit rating in international markets had collapsed. British investors refused to purchase French government bonds because they questioned whether the Bourbon monarchy could survive politically. Austrian and Prussian banks avoided French securities because they doubted France's ability to generate sufficient revenues to service such massive debts. German financial houses were reluctant to lend money to a country that had recently been their enemy and might become their enemy again. Traditional French banks were equally pessimistic about their own government's prospects. Parisian financial houses had been devastated by the wars and lacked capital for major lending operations. Regional banks were focused on local commercial activities and had no experience with international finance. The French central bank was politically constrained and couldn't provide funding that might be seen as favoring particular political factions. French Finance Minister Louis-Emmanuel Corvetto approached James with a proposition that was simultaneously an opportunity and a threat. Would the Rothschild network be willing to become France's primary source of international credit, effectively replacing traditional French financial institutions as the government's banker? The request was extraordinary in its scope. Corvetto was asking James to coordinate all French government borrowing in international markets, manage currency exchanges for reparations payments, handle diplomatic transfers related to occupation costs, and provide ongoing credit lines for government operations. The total financial responsibility would exceed 500 million francs annually, making James more important to French government operations than any French institution. For James, the proposal represented the ultimate validation of his strategy. 3 years earlier, he had arrived in Paris as a young foreign banker with ambitious plans but limited resources. Now the French government was offering to make him their most important financial partner, with responsibilities that exceeded those of cabinet ministers. But the opportunity came with enormous risks. If James accepted primary responsibility for French government finance and the arrangement failed, he would be blamed for France's economic collapse and potentially face political persecution or worse. If he succeeded but France's political situation deteriorated, he might be seen as an enabler of unpopular policies. If other European governments disapproved of his arrangement with France, he could lose access to international markets that were essential to Rothschild operations. James's response demonstrated the sophisticated political analysis that had become central to Rothschild decision-making. He agreed to serve as France's primary international banker, but only under conditions that protected his broader European relationships while maximizing his influence over French policy. First, James insisted that his arrangement with France be structured as a commercial relationship rather than a political alliance. He would provide financial services in exchange for competitive compensation, but he wouldn't be seen as a partisan supporter of any particular French political faction. This neutrality would allow him to maintain relationships with French opposition groups while preserving his credibility with other European governments. Second, James demanded that French officials coordinate their borrowing requests with coalition governments to ensure that his services to France didn't conflict with his obligations to other clients. This requirement meant that French financial policy would be subject to international oversight, but it also meant that James wouldn't be forced to choose between conflicting loyalties. Third, James required that the French government provide him with detailed information about their political and economic plans so that he could evaluate risks accurately and structure financial arrangements appropriately. This intelligence access would make James one of the best-informed individuals in Europe about French government activities. The arrangement that James negotiated with Corvetto established precedents that would define government-banker relationships for decades. Instead of traditional loans with fixed terms, James created flexible credit lines that could be adjusted based on changing political and economic conditions. Instead of simple interest payments, He structured compensation packages that included fees for various services, currency exchange, international transfers, market analysis, and political risk assessment. Most importantly, James established the principle that major government borrowing required international coordination through institutions that could manage complex, multinational financial arrangements. Traditional banks that operated within single countries couldn't handle the sophisticated transactions that modern governments needed for international obligations. The first major test of the new arrangement came in September 1817, when coalition forces demanded immediate payment of 150 million francs in reparations installments. French treasury officials had assumed that they could delay payments through diplomatic negotiations, but coalition commanders refused to extend deadlines and threatened to impose additional occupation costs if payments were late. James arranged the required payments within 2 weeks through a complex transaction that involved 4 different currencies and 6 different national markets. French government bonds were sold to British investors for pounds, which were converted to Austrian currency through the Vienna market, then exchanged for Prussian thalers through Berlin operations, and finally converted to French francs for delivery to coalition representatives. The transaction required coordination between multiple Rothschild banks, careful timing to take advantage of favorable exchange rates, and sophisticated hedging operations to protect against currency fluctuations during the 2-week settlement period. Traditional banking houses would have needed months to arrange similar payments, and the costs would have been substantially higher because they couldn't coordinate international operations as effectively. Success in managing the September payment established James's credibility with both French officials and coalition commanders. French ministers realized that Rothschild financial services could solve problems that had seemed impossible through traditional channels. Coalition representatives discovered that James could guarantee payments that they had doubted France could deliver. More importantly, the arrangement demonstrated that effective modern government required international financial capabilities that traditional national banking systems couldn't provide. Countries that limited themselves to domestic financial resources would be unable to meet their international obligations. Governments that could access international credit markets through sophisticated banking networks would have enormous advantages in managing both domestic and foreign policy. James had positioned himself at the center of this transformation. European governments that needed international financial services discovered that the Rothschild network was their only viable option. Political leaders who wanted to pursue ambitious policies that required substantial funding found that they needed Rothschild approval to access international credit markets. By 1818, James was handling over 60% of French government borrowing and had become the single most important source of international credit for the Bourbon monarchy. His Paris offices processed more international financial transactions than the French treasury. His political intelligence was consulted by French ministers who needed to understand how their policies might affect their ability to access international funding. The Jewish banker, who had been excluded from his homeland because of anti-Semitic laws, had become indispensable to the French government that was supposed to represent Catholic European civilization. The refugee who had fled persecution was now consulted by kings and ministers who needed his financial support to maintain their political authority. France had been saved from bankruptcy, but the price was accepting that their nation's economic sovereignty now depended on the cooperation of international financial networks that operated beyond traditional government control. Chapter 8. Financial Dominance. By 1820, James Rothschild's transformation of European finance was complete. The family banking network controlled an estimated 50% of all international government lending, managed currency exchanges worth over 200 million francs annually, and operated intelligence services that informed policy decisions in every major European capital. Traditional banking houses had been reduced to handling routine domestic transactions, while the Rothschild empire dominated international finance. The source of this dominance wasn't just superior capital, it was superior organization. While other banks remained limited to single-country operations, the Rothschild network functioned as an integrated international system. When the British government needed to transfer subsidies to continental allies, they used Rothschild services because no British bank could handle complex multi-currency transactions efficiently. When Austrian officials required financing for infrastructure projects, they turned to Rothschild banks because no Austrian institution could access international capital markets effectively. James's Paris operation had become the nerve center for European financial intelligence. His agents tracked government revenues in every major country, monitored political developments that might affect credit ratings, analyzed economic conditions that could impact currency values, and evaluated military situations that might influence government borrowing requirements. This information was packaged into comprehensive reports that were sold to investors, government officials, and commercial enterprises across the continent. The intelligence operations generated enormous revenues, independent of traditional banking profits. European governments paid substantial fees for reports about economic conditions in other countries. Investors purchased market analysis that incorporated political intelligence unavailable through other sources. Commercial enterprises bought assessments of business conditions in foreign markets where they were considering expansion. But James's most profitable innovation was his creation of secondary markets for government securities. Traditional government bonds were purchased by investors who held them until maturity, receiving fixed interest payments and principal repayment after several years. There was no mechanism for selling government bonds before maturity, which meant that investors who needed cash couldn't access their capital until bonds matured. The Rothschild network created the world's first international market for trading government securities. Investors who owned British government bonds could sell them through Rothschild markets and receive immediate cash. Investors who wanted to purchase Austrian securities could buy them through Rothschild operations without dealing directly with Austrian government officials. Investors who needed to convert holdings in one country's bonds to another country's securities could arrange exchanges through Rothschild intermediation. This secondary market activity generated multiple revenue streams for James's operations. The network collected commissions on bond sales, fees for currency conversions, charges for market analysis, and profits from arbitrage trading between different national markets. More importantly, the trading activity provided continuous information about investor preferences, political risks, economic conditions, and financial trends that enhanced the value of Rothschild intelligence services. The creation of international government bond markets also gave James unprecedented influence over government policy. Officials who knew that their borrowing costs depended on investor confidence in their policies had to consider financial market reactions when making political decisions. Governments that pursued policies which investors considered risky would face higher interest rates and reduced access to credit. Governments that maintained policies which financial markets supported would benefit from lower borrowing costs and easier access to international capital. James demonstrated this influence in 1821, when the Spanish government requested loans to finance military operations against colonial independence movements in South America. Traditional diplomatic analysis suggested that Spain had reasonable prospects for maintaining colonial control, but Rothschild intelligence indicated that independence movements were better organized and more financially capable than Spanish officials realized. Instead of simply refusing the loan request, James structured his response to influence Spanish policy. He offered to provide funding for Spanish operations, but only if Spain agreed to negotiate political settlements with colonial representatives rather than pursuing purely military solutions. If Spain insisted on military-only approaches, the loan terms would be substantially more expensive and the credit would be limited to shorter periods. The Spanish government initially rejected James's conditions, but they discovered that no other international lender could provide adequate funding for extended military campaigns across multiple colonial territories. Traditional Spanish banks lacked sufficient capital. Other European banks were reluctant to finance colonial wars that might fail and result in loan defaults. After 6 months of unsuccessful efforts to find alternative funding sources, Spanish officials returned to James and accepted his conditions. The loans they received were used primarily for negotiating political settlements with colonial leaders rather than financing military operations. Several South American territories gained independence through negotiated agreements that protected Spanish commercial interests while ending expensive military campaigns. The Spanish colonial arrangement established a precedent that would define Rothschild influence for decades. Governments that needed access to international capital markets had to consider financial market preferences when making policy decisions. Political leaders might have military force and legal authority, but they needed Rothschild cooperation to finance their most important initiatives. This influence extended beyond simple loan approval or rejection. James began including specific policy recommendations in his financial proposals to government clients. Governments that wanted favorable loan terms were encouraged to pursue policies that financial markets would support: balanced budgets, reduced military expenditures, improved commercial regulations, enhanced international trade relationships. Governments that ignored these recommendations faced higher borrowing costs, reduced access to credit, and negative assessments in the intelligence reports that James distributed to investors throughout Europe. Governments that adopted Rothschild policy recommendations received preferential treatment in loan negotiations and positive evaluations in market analysis reports. The system created powerful incentives for governments to align their policies with financial market preferences rather than purely political considerations. Traditional European governance had been based on aristocratic privilege, military authority, and religious legitimacy. James was introducing a new model where financial market access became a critical component of political power. European aristocrats who had initially dismissed James as a nouveau riche merchant discovered that their governments needed his cooperation to function effectively. Military commanders who had viewed bankers as mere suppliers realized that financial constraints could determine military capabilities more directly than strategic planning. Religious leaders who had considered commercial activities morally questionable found that their institutions needed access to international credit markets for major building projects and charitable activities. The social transformation was as significant as the political changes. European high society, which had traditionally excluded Jewish participation, began competing for James's attention and approval. Aristocratic families who needed access to credit for maintaining their estates sought invitations to Rothschild social events. Government officials who required financial cooperation for their policy initiatives cultivated personal relationships with James and his associates. James leveraged these social changes to enhance his political influence and commercial opportunities. He purchased estates in prestigious locations, established salons where political and financial leaders could meet informally, sponsored cultural activities that attracted influential participants, and developed personal relationships that transcended purely commercial interactions. By 1825, James had achieved a level of social and political integration that would have been impossible for any Jewish individual in Europe just a generation earlier. The same aristocratic society that had excluded his parents now competed for his approval. The same political institutions that had persecuted his community now depended on his cooperation. The transformation reflected broader changes in European society that James had helped to accelerate. Traditional sources of power, aristocratic birth, military command, religious authority, were being supplemented by new forms of influence based on financial capability, information access, and international connections. The emerging industrial economy required capital, expertise, and international coordination that traditional institutions couldn't provide. James had positioned himself at the center of these changes, transforming personal success into institutional influence that would reshape European political and economic development for generations. Chapter 9. Railway Revolution. In 1825, James Rothschild witnessed a demonstration that would revolutionize his understanding of industrial investment and fundamentally reshape European economic development. George Stephenson's steam locomotive, Locomotion No. 1, successfully traveled 26 miles on the Stockton and Darlington Railway in England, proving that steam-powered transportation could move heavy cargo and passengers faster and more efficiently than traditional horse-drawn systems. Most European observers viewed the railway demonstration as an interesting mechanical curiosity with limited commercial application. Existing transportation systems, canals, rivers, and road networks seemed adequate for current commercial requirements. The enormous capital investments required for railway construction appeared disproportionate to potential benefits, especially given the unproven nature of steam technology and the substantial technical challenges involved in large-scale railway operations. James saw something different, the greatest investment opportunity in European history. Railway networks would transform commercial transportation, reduce shipping costs, accelerate economic development, and generate returns that would dwarf profits from traditional banking operations. More importantly, railway investment would require exactly the kind of international capital coordination that the Rothschild network was uniquely positioned to provide. Traditional transportation systems were reaching their limits as European commerce expanded during the post-Napoleonic recovery. Canal construction was expensive and geographically constrained. River transportation was limited by seasonal water levels and couldn't serve landlocked regions effectively. Road systems required massive maintenance expenditures and were vulnerable to weather disruptions. Railway networks could solve all these problems simultaneously. Steam locomotives could operate year-round in most weather conditions. Railway construction could connect any 2 points, regardless of geographical obstacles. Railway transportation could move cargo and passengers faster than any alternative system. Railway networks could serve both urban areas and remote regions through coordinated scheduling and interconnected routes. But railway development required capital investments on a scale that exceeded the capacity of traditional financial institutions. A single railway line connecting 2 major cities might cost 10 to 20 million francs, equivalent to roughly $100 million in today's money. National railway networks would require hundreds of millions in funding over periods of decades. No single bank or government could finance such massive projects alone. James recognized that successful railway development would require international capital markets that could coordinate investments across multiple countries and currencies. British investors might provide initial funding for railway construction, but French, German, and Austrian capital would be needed for comprehensive network development. Italian and Swiss investors might participate in specific projects, but only if their investments were coordinated with broader European railway planning. The Rothschild network was perfectly positioned to coordinate such complex international investments. Their relationships with government officials could facilitate regulatory approvals required for railway construction. Their intelligence services could evaluate the commercial viability of proposed railway routes. Their financial capabilities could structure investment arrangements that attracted capital from multiple national markets simultaneously. James's first major railway investment was his participation in financing the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, which opened in 1830 and immediately demonstrated the commercial potential of steam transportation. The railway generated profits that exceeded initial projections by 40%, while reducing shipping costs between Liverpool and Manchester by 60%. Passenger service proved even more profitable than anticipated, with demand exceeding capacity during most operating periods. The Liverpool-Manchester success convinced James that railway investment would become the dominant form of European capital allocation for the next several decades. Governments that developed extensive railway networks would gain enormous advantages in commercial development, military logistics, and international trade. Regions that lacked railway connections would be economically disadvantaged regardless of their other resources or capabilities. James began developing comprehensive plans for French railway development that would serve both commercial and strategic objectives. French railway networks could connect Paris with major ports, industrial centers, and border regions, improving both domestic commerce and international trade. Railway construction would stimulate demand for iron, steel, coal, and manufactured goods, accelerating French industrial development. Railway operations would generate employment for thousands of workers, while providing improved transportation services for millions of passengers and commercial enterprises. But French railway development faced significant political and financial obstacles. The French government was reluctant to authorize large-scale private railway construction because officials feared that foreign investors might gain too much influence over French transportation infrastructure. French banks lacked sufficient capital for major railway investments and were hesitant to commit resources to unproven technology. Traditional French commercial interests opposed railway development because they feared competition from more efficient transportation systems. James addressed these concerns through careful negotiation and strategic compromise. He proposed that French railway companies be structured as joint ventures between French and international investors, with French partners maintaining majority control, while international partners provided technical expertise and additional capital. Railway operations would be regulated by French government agencies, but commercial decisions would be made by private company management. Most importantly, James offered to guarantee that railway investments would be structured to serve French national interests rather than foreign commercial objectives. Railway routes would be designed to improve French military logistics and domestic commerce. Railway construction would employ French workers and purchase materials from French suppliers when possible. Railway operations would be managed by French citizens who understood local conditions and government requirements. The guarantees James provided were credible because his broader European operations gave him incentives to maintain positive relationships with all the governments where Rothschild banks operated. If French officials believed that railway investments were structured to benefit foreign interests at French expense, they could retaliate by restricting other Rothschild activities in France. If French railway development succeeded and enhanced French economic capabilities, other European governments would be more likely to approve similar Rothschild railway projects in their territories. James's most innovative contribution to French railway development was his creation of investment structures that attracted capital from small investors as well as major financial institutions. Traditional railway financing was limited to wealthy individuals and established banks that could afford substantial investments in unproven technology. This limited the total capital available for railway construction and concentrated ownership among a small group of investors. James developed railway securities that could be purchased by middle-class investors who wanted to participate in industrial development but couldn't afford major investments. These securities provided steady returns based on railway revenues while allowing investors to sell their holdings if they needed cash before railway projects were completed. The democratization of railway investment created enormous political support for railway development while generating additional capital for construction projects. Middle-class investors who owned railway securities became advocates for government policies that supported railway expansion. Commercial enterprises that used railway services became supporters of continued railway investment. Workers who were employed by railway companies or suppliers became constituents for political leaders who supported railway development. By 1835, James was coordinating railway investments worth over 50 million francs annually, while managing construction projects that employed more than 10,000 workers across France. The Rothschild network had become the primary source of capital for European railway development, with operations extending from British railway companies to Austrian transportation projects. The railway investments generated extraordinary financial returns. Annual profits often exceeded 15% of invested capital, while creating strategic influence that enhanced Rothschild power across multiple dimensions. Governments that depended on Rothschild-financed railway networks for military logistics and commercial transportation were reluctant to pursue policies that might jeopardize their relationships with the Rothschild network. Commercial enterprises that relied on railway transportation for their operations became indirect stakeholders in continued Rothschild success. Railway development also generated intelligence value that complemented traditional Rothschild information services. Railway construction required detailed surveys of geographic conditions, economic resources, population distributions, and commercial activities across entire regions. This information was valuable for government planning, military operations, commercial development, and investment decisions that extended far beyond railway operations. James had positioned himself at the center of the industrial transformation that was reshaping European economic development. The banking network that had been built to serve government financing requirements during wartime had evolved into an industrial investment system that was determining the pace and direction of peacetime economic modernization. Chapter 10. Legacy Control. By 1840, James de Rothschild had achieved something unprecedented in European history. A Jewish banker from Frankfurt controlled more economic influence than most kings and emperors. His wealth was estimated at over 600 million francs, equivalent to roughly 3 billion today. But his true power lay in the institutional systems he had created that would outlast any individual fortune. The Rothschild banking network now operated in every major European capital, handling more international financial transactions than all other banking houses combined. European governments routinely consulted James about policy decisions that might affect their access to international credit markets. Railway development across the continent depended on Rothschild investment coordination. Commercial enterprises planning international expansion sought Rothschild partnership to access foreign markets effectively. James understood that individual wealth, however vast, was vulnerable to political changes, economic disruptions, and personal mortality. Institutional influence, properly structured, could persist across generations and survive political upheavals that destroyed traditional sources of power. The key was creating systems that made Rothschild services essential to European economic functioning rather than merely convenient. His approach to building lasting institutional control was systematic and sophisticated. Instead of concentrating Rothschild operations in financial services alone, James diversified into industries that provided essential resources for modern economic development. Mining operations that controlled access to raw materials, manufacturing enterprises that produced industrial equipment, transportation companies that moved goods and people, insurance services that managed commercial risks. Each industry served multiple strategic purposes. Mining operations generated profits from commodity sales while providing intelligence about resource availability that informed broader investment decisions. Manufacturing enterprises created revenue streams while establishing relationships with industrial clients who needed ongoing financial services. Transportation companies produced returns while creating dependencies among commercial users who relied on Rothschild-controlled logistics. The diversification strategy also created powerful defensive capabilities. Governments that considered policies hostile to Rothschild interests had to weigh potential benefits against economic disruptions that might result from reduced cooperation with Rothschild-controlled enterprises. Commercial competitors who challenged Rothschild market positions faced potential retaliation across multiple industries where the network maintained significant influence. James's most important institutional innovation was his creation of intergenerational wealth transfer mechanisms that preserved family control while accommodating the different interests and capabilities of future generations. Traditional European fortunes often dissipated within 2 or 3 generations because inheritance systems divided assets among multiple heirs while failing to maintain coordinated management of family enterprises. The Rothschild system avoided these problems through careful legal structuring that separated ownership from control. Family members received income from Rothschild enterprises without gaining individual authority over strategic decisions. Investment planning was managed by professional staff who served family interests while maintaining operational continuity regardless of changes in family composition or individual preferences. Most importantly, James established educational and cultural institutions that would ensure future generations understood their responsibilities and possessed the capabilities required for effective wealth management. Family members were expected to master multiple languages, understand international commercial practices, maintain relationships with political and business leaders across Europe, and demonstrate competence in specific aspects of Rothschild operations before assuming significant responsibilities. The institutional architecture James created was designed to survive not just individual mortality, but also major political disruptions. Railway investments were structured through legal entities in multiple countries, so that political changes in any single nation couldn't destroy the network's transportation assets. Banking operations were distributed across different national markets, ensuring that regulatory changes in one location wouldn't cripple overall financial capabilities. Government bond holdings were diversified across multiple currencies and political systems, providing protection against default by any single government while maintaining access to international credit markets, regardless of which political parties controlled various national governments. Intelligence operations were compartmentalized so that compromise of any single network wouldn't destroy overall information gathering capabilities. James also recognized that long-term success required managing the social and political tensions created by extraordinary wealth concentration. European society was experiencing democratic pressures that challenged traditional aristocratic privilege. Popular movements were questioning whether enormous fortunes were compatible with social justice and political equality. His response was to position the Rothschild network as a force for European economic modernization, rather than simply a vehicle for personal enrichment. Rothschild railway investments created employment for hundreds of thousands of workers while improving transportation services for millions of users. Rothschild industrial enterprises contributed to technological development that enhanced productivity and living standards. Rothschild financial services facilitated international trade that expanded economic opportunities across national boundaries. James encouraged media coverage that emphasized the productive aspects of Rothschild activities while downplaying purely speculative or exploitative dimensions. Public relations efforts highlighted the family's contributions to charitable causes, cultural institutions, and social improvement projects. Political relationships were managed to ensure that Rothschild interests aligned with broader social benefits rather than conflicting with popular welfare. The strategy was tested during the revolutionary upheavals of 1848, when popular movements across Europe challenged existing political and economic arrangements. Traditional aristocratic fortunes were threatened by demands for property redistribution, wealth taxation, and restrictions on inherited privilege. Many established banking houses faced political persecution or confiscation by revolutionary governments. The Rothschild network not only survived the 1848 revolutions, but actually strengthened its position by providing financial services that revolutionary governments needed to fund their operations. Republican leaders who had criticized aristocratic privilege discovered that they required access to international credit markets to finance their political programs. Democratic movements that had opposed foreign financial influence found that they needed Rothschild cooperation to manage currency exchanges and international payments. James's ability to serve multiple conflicting political factions simultaneously during the 1848 crisis demonstrated the institutional resilience he had built into Rothschild operations. The network's services were too valuable to eliminate and too complex to replace, regardless of which political movements controlled various European governments. By 1844, the year of James's death, he had accomplished his ultimate objective, creating financial institutions that were essential to European economic functioning and therefore immune to political changes that destroyed traditional sources of wealth and power. The Rothschild network had become part of the infrastructure of modern European civilization, as necessary to economic development as transportation systems, communication networks, or government institutions. The Jewish refugee who had fled anti-Semitic persecution in Frankfurt had created a financial empire that commanded respect from the same social and political establishments that had rejected his community for centuries. The young banker who had arrived in Paris during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow had built institutional systems that would influence European development long after Napoleon's empire was forgotten. James understood that his greatest achievement wasn't personal wealth or social recognition. It was creating permanent institutional change that would provide opportunities and security for future generations who would never face the limitations and dangers that had shaped his own life. He had transformed not just his family's circumstances, but the entire relationship between financial capability and political power in modern European society. The institutions James built would continue operating according to the principles he established, serving European economic development while preserving Rothschild influence across generations of social and political change. His true legacy wasn't the fortune he accumulated, but the institutional systems he created that would make similar fortunes possible for others who understood how to align private interests with broader social benefits. When you step back and look at the full picture of James de Rothschild's life, You're witnessing more than just a story of individual success. You're seeing the creation of modern international finance itself. The systems he built, the precedents he established, and the institutional changes he drove forward didn't just make one family wealthy. They fundamentally altered how money, information, and political power interact in the modern world. Today, 180 years after James's death, the global financial system still operates according to principles he pioneered. International banks coordinate operations across multiple countries and currencies. Financial markets influence government policy through bond ratings and capital flows. Private intelligence networks gather information that moves markets and shapes political decisions. Investment banking coordinates massive industrial projects that reshape entire economies. The European Union's financial integration, global foreign exchange markets, international government bond trading, multinational investment coordination, all of these modern systems trace their origins directly to innovations that James developed to serve the Rothschild network's commercial and political objectives. But James's legacy extends beyond financial architecture. He demonstrated that outsiders could gain influence within established social and political systems by making themselves indispensable rather than seeking direct confrontation. Jewish communities across Europe gained economic opportunities and social acceptance partly because James had shown that financial capability could overcome religious prejudice and social exclusion. The same strategy would later be adopted by other marginalized groups who used economic achievement to gain political influence and social recognition. American immigrant communities, British colonial subjects, European religious minorities, many followed paths that James had pioneered in transforming economic success into broader social integration. Yet, James's story also reveals the moral complexities that arise when private interests become intertwined with public welfare. His financial services genuinely contributed to European economic development, but they also concentrated enormous power in private institutions that operated beyond traditional democratic accountability. His intelligence networks provided information that helped governments make better decisions, but they also enabled manipulation of financial markets that extracted wealth from less informed investors. The wealth James accumulated was partly the result of productive economic activities that created genuine value for European society. Railway construction, government debt management, international trade facilitation, these services contributed to economic growth that benefited millions of people. But his fortune also resulted from information advantages, market manipulation, and political influence that allowed him to extract value from economic activities without necessarily creating equivalent benefits for others. This tension between private profit and public benefit remains central to debates about modern financial systems. Should private institutions be allowed to accumulate the kind of influence that James wielded over European governments? Can democratic societies maintain accountability over financial networks that operate internationally beyond any single government's jurisdiction? How do we balance the innovation and efficiency that private financial markets provide against the concentration of power that successful private institutions inevitably create? James's relationship with political authority also established patterns that continue shaping modern governance. He showed that governments need access to international financial markets more than financial markets need any particular government. This insight has become central to contemporary political economy, where bond ratings agencies, international investors, and financial institutions exercise influence over government policy through their control over credit access. The European debt crises of recent decades, emerging market financial instability, and developing country struggles with international creditors all reflect dynamics that James first identified and exploited during the post-Napoleonic reconstruction. Government sovereignty remains constrained by financial market requirements, and political leaders continue to discover that their policy options are limited by their need to maintain credibility with international investors. Perhaps most importantly, James demonstrated that information could be transformed into the ultimate source of competitive advantage. His intelligence network was more valuable than his capital, his political relationships, or his operational capabilities. In our current era of digital communication, data analytics and artificial intelligence, This lesson has become even more relevant. Modern financial institutions invest billions in information systems that can process market data faster than competitors. Technology companies derive their market value primarily from information assets rather than physical resources. Political campaigns increasingly focus on data collection and analysis rather than traditional persuasion methods. James's recognition that information was the most valuable commodity anticipated transformations that have become central to contemporary economic and political competition. The story of how James Rothschild saved France from bankruptcy while controlling Napoleon's wars illustrates timeless themes about power, opportunity, and social change that remain relevant regardless of historical period. Individuals who can provide essential services during times of crisis gain influence that persists long after the immediate crisis has passed. Institutions that position themselves to serve multiple competing interests can survive political changes that destroy organizations with more limited capabilities. Communities that are excluded from traditional power structures can gain influence through innovation and strategic positioning rather than direct confrontation with established authority. Economic achievement can overcome social prejudice, but only if it's combined with political sophistication and strategic patience. Whether we consider James's legacy positive or negative depends partly on our perspective about the role of private financial institutions in modern society. His innovations contributed to European economic development while concentrating enormous power in private hands. His intelligence networks improved decision-making while enabling market manipulation. His wealth creation generated opportunities for others while establishing precedents for inequality that persist today. The real lesson isn't whether James was a hero or a villain. It's that individual achievement in complex social systems inevitably involves moral ambiguity. The same capabilities that enable productive contribution to social welfare can also be used to extract private benefits at public expense. The same innovations that solve pressing social problems can also create new forms of inequality and social tension. So the question that remains is this: in our contemporary world of global financial markets, international capital flows, and private institutions that wield enormous influence over public policy, how do we capture the benefits that individuals like James can provide while minimizing the risks that concentrated private power creates for democratic governance and social justice? That challenge, balancing private innovation with public accountability, encouraging productive achievement while preventing exploitative extraction, remains as relevant today as it was when a young Jewish refugee from Frankfurt first arrived in Paris with ambitious plans and unlimited determination. The death of James de Rothschild in November 1868 marked the end of an era, but the beginning of a legacy that would reshape global finance for the next century and beyond. His funeral procession through Paris drew crowds of thousands. Government ministers, railway workers, fellow bankers, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the empire he built. Yet even as they mourned the man, the institutions he created were already evolving beyond anything he could have imagined. The immediate aftermath of James's death revealed the true genius of the systems he had constructed. While other family fortunes typically fragmented after the founder's passing, the Rothschild network actually strengthened. His sons Alphonse, Gustave, and Edmond didn't inherit a static wealth pile. They inherited a living, breathing financial organism that could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining its essential character. The first test came within months of James's funeral. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 created exactly the kind of financial chaos that had originally made the Rothschild fortune. Traditional banking houses retreated from international operations as military conflict disrupted established commercial relationships. Currency markets became volatile as investors fled to safe assets. Government borrowing requirements exploded as both sides needed massive funding for military operations. But the second generation of Rothschilds responded with capabilities that exceeded even James's wartime innovations. The intelligence network he had built now operated through telegraph systems that could transmit information across Europe in hours rather than days. The banking relationships he had established provided access to capital markets that traditional institutions couldn't match. The political connections he had cultivated gave the family influence over government policy decisions that determined financial market conditions. More importantly, the industrial investments that James had pioneered during the Railway Revolution had created revenue streams that were independent of traditional banking profits. Rothschild mining operations controlled access to raw materials that both French and Prussian forces needed for military production. Rothschild transportation companies managed logistics that determined whether armies could maintain their supply lines. Rothschild manufacturing enterprises produced equipment that influenced military capabilities on both sides. This industrial diversification meant that the family profited from wartime economic activity, regardless of which side won the conflict. Traditional banks could lose everything if they chose the wrong government to support. The Rothschild network generated returns from economic activities that served whoever controlled territory where their operations were located. The strategic implications were profound. James had built more than a banking empire. He had created an economic infrastructure that was essential to European civilization. Governments might change, political systems might evolve, military alliances might shift, but the financial and industrial networks that kept modern society functioning would remain under Rothschild influence. This infrastructure power became even more significant as European economies industrialized throughout the late 19th century. The steel production that built modern cities required raw materials from Rothschild-controlled mines. The railway systems that connected national markets depended on Rothschild investment coordination. The electrical generation that powered industrial development relied on Rothschild financial backing for major construction projects. European governments discovered that their ability to pursue independent economic policies was constrained by their dependence on Rothschild-controlled economic infrastructure. Countries that maintained positive relationships with the family received preferential access to investment capital, raw materials, and industrial capabilities. Countries that pursued policies the Rothschilds opposed faced higher borrowing costs, reduced access to essential resources, and potential disruption of industrial operations. The influence extended beyond Europe as the family's operations expanded globally during the late 19th century. Rothschild banks financed railway construction across the Americas, mining operations in Africa, and commercial development in Asia. The intelligence network that James had built to monitor European political developments became a global information system that tracked economic conditions, political changes, and investment opportunities across multiple continents. By 1900, the Rothschild network controlled an estimated 40% of the world's wealth, a level of economic concentration that has never been achieved before or since by any private institution. Traditional measures of national power, military force, territorial control, population size, were being supplemented by financial capabilities that could influence economic conditions across multiple countries simultaneously. Yet the family's greatest achievement during this period was their successful adaptation to changing political conditions that challenged traditional forms of concentrated wealth. Democratic movements across Europe demanded greater political accountability and economic equality. Socialist parties advocated wealth redistribution and public control of major economic resources. Nationalist movements questioned whether international financial networks were compatible with national sovereignty. The Rothschilds survived these challenges by positioning themselves as enablers of economic modernization, rather than obstacles to social progress. Their railway investments created employment for millions of workers while improving transportation services that benefited entire populations. Their industrial enterprises contributed to technological development that enhanced productivity and living standards. Their financial services facilitated international trade that expanded economic opportunities across national boundaries. More importantly, the family supported political and social reforms that addressed legitimate concerns about concentrated wealth while preserving the institutional systems that maintained their influence. They advocated for progressive taxation that reduced inequality without eliminating incentives for productive investment. They supported labor regulations that improved working conditions without undermining industrial competitiveness. They endorsed democratic reforms that enhanced political accountability without destroying the stability that financial markets required. This strategic accommodation allowed the Rothschilds to maintain their economic influence through political transformations that destroyed other aristocratic fortunes. While traditional European nobility lost power to democratic movements, the Rothschild network adapted to serve democratically elected governments. While other wealthy families faced confiscation or persecution by socialist movements, the Rothschilds demonstrated that their wealth served broader social benefits. The family's approach to the emerging American economy illustrated their sophisticated understanding of how to maintain influence across different political and economic systems. Instead of attempting to transplant European banking methods to American markets, they formed partnerships with established American financial institutions that understood local conditions. Instead of competing directly with American industrial enterprises, they provided capital and expertise that enhanced American economic development, while creating profitable opportunities for Rothschild investment. The result was that American economic expansion during the Gilded Age was partly financed through Rothschild networks while serving American national interests. Railroad construction, mining development, industrial growth, and urban expansion all benefited from Rothschild capital coordination, while generating returns that strengthened the family's global financial position. This pattern was repeated across multiple countries as the global economy integrated during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Rothschild influence expanded not through direct control of foreign economies, but through partnership arrangements that served local development objectives while creating opportunities for family profit. The approach reflected lessons that James had learned during his original European operations. Sustainable influence required providing services that local populations valued rather than simply extracting wealth through superior financial power. Countries that benefited from Rothschild investment became supporters of continued family involvement in their economic development. Populations that gained employment and improved living standards through Rothschild-financed projects became constituencies for policies that protected foreign investment. By the early 20th century, the economic infrastructure that James had begun building during the Napoleonic Wars had evolved into a global financial system that influenced economic development across multiple continents. The intelligence networks, political relationships, and institutional capabilities that had originally served European commercial objectives now shaped international economic conditions that affected billions of people. Yet this global influence also created new vulnerabilities that James could never have anticipated. The very success of Rothschild operations made them targets for political movements that blamed international financial networks for various social and economic problems. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories portrayed the family as puppet masters who secretly controlled world events. Nationalist movements accused them of prioritizing international profits over national welfare. Socialist critics argued that concentrated financial power was incompatible with democratic governance. The family responded to these attacks through a combination of strategic discretion and public relations sophistication. They reduced their public visibility while maintaining their actual influence through less conspicuous institutional arrangements. They supported charitable and cultural activities that demonstrated their contributions to social welfare. They cultivated relationships with media organizations that could provide balanced coverage of their activities while countering conspiracy theories and propaganda. Most importantly, they adapted their operational methods to serve changing social expectations about wealth and power in democratic societies. Instead of the highly visible individual influence that James had wielded, subsequent generations operated through institutional networks that were less obviously connected to family control, but equally effective at achieving their objectives. The transformation was tested during World War I, when European political and economic systems faced disruptions that exceeded anything James had experienced during the Napoleonic era. Traditional international financial relationships collapsed as countries pursued total war strategies that subordinated economic considerations to military objectives. Established commercial networks were destroyed as governments requisitioned private assets for war production. International travel and communication were restricted as military security took precedence over civilian economic activity. Yet the Rothschild network not only survived the World War I disruption, but emerged with enhanced influence over post-war economic reconstruction. Their global operations provided access to American capital markets that European governments needed for war debt refinancing. Their industrial investments gave them influence over production capabilities that were essential for post-war economic recovery. Their political relationships enabled them to participate in peace negotiations that determined the economic structure of the post-war world. The war's aftermath demonstrated how thoroughly James's original innovations had transformed the relationship between private financial power and public policy authority. Governments that had wielded enormous authority during wartime discovered that they needed cooperation from international financial networks to manage post-war economic challenges. Political leaders who had commanded vast military resources found that their peacetime policy options were constrained by financial market requirements that private institutions could influence more effectively than government officials. This pattern would be repeated throughout the 20th century as democratic governments faced economic challenges that required international cooperation and private sector expertise. The Great Depression, World War II, post-colonial development, Cold War competition, and globalization all created opportunities for institutional networks with global capabilities to influence policy decisions that shaped economic development for entire populations. The Rothschild family's ability to maintain influence through these successive crises reflected the enduring value of the strategic principles that James had developed during his original European operations. Providing essential services during periods of crisis creates influence that persists after immediate problems are resolved. Building relationships with multiple competing interests provides protection against political changes that destroy organizations with narrower constituencies. Investing in infrastructure that serves long-term social needs creates sustainable influence that transcends temporary political configurations. James de Rothschild had died believing that he had built institutional systems that would preserve his family's influence for several generations. He could never have imagined that the principles he established would continue shaping global economic development more than 150 years after his death, or that the financial networks he created would evolve into institutional systems that influence economic conditions for billions of people across every continent. Yet that transformation reflects the ultimate vindication of James's strategic vision. He understood that sustainable power required creating value for others rather than simply accumulating wealth for personal benefit. He recognized that lasting influence required adapting to changing conditions rather than attempting to preserve static advantages. He realized that institutional success required serving broader social needs rather than narrow private interests. Today, as we grapple with questions about the appropriate role of private financial institutions in democratic societies, about the balance between innovation and accountability in global economic systems, and about the relationship between individual achievement and collective welfare, we are still working through challenges that James Rothschild first identified and addressed during his remarkable career. His legacy isn't just the wealth his family accumulated or the institutions they created. It's the demonstration that individual vision and determination can reshape entire civilizations when they are guided by sophisticated understanding of how private interests can be aligned with broader social benefits. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was when a young Jewish refugee first arrived in Paris with unlimited ambition and the strategic intelligence to transform personal opportunity into institutional change that would influence human history for generations. The shadow of James Rothschild's empire extends far beyond any individual fortune or family legacy. It encompasses the entire structure of modern international finance, the relationship between private economic power and public policy authority, and the ongoing tension between individual achievement and collective welfare that defines contemporary debates about wealth, power, and social responsibility. Whether we consider that shadow beneficial or threatening depends on our perspective about the role of private institutions in modern society. But there is no question that understanding how James built his empire provides essential insights into how individual decisions during historical crisis points can establish patterns that influence social development for centuries afterward. The financial systems, political relationships, and institutional networks that James created continue operating according to principles he established, serving global economic development while preserving patterns of influence that reflect his strategic vision. His story demonstrates both the extraordinary possibilities and the profound responsibilities that come with the power to reshape civilization through individual achievement guided by institutional innovation. In our current era of global financial integration, technological transformation, and democratic accountability, the questions that James Rothschild raised about the relationship between private wealth and public welfare remain central to humanity's ongoing effort to create economic systems that serve both individual opportunity and collective prosperity. His legacy challenges us to consider how we can capture the benefits that exceptional individuals can provide, while ensuring that concentrated private power serves broader social benefits rather than narrow personal interests. That challenge, balancing innovation with accountability, achievement with responsibility, private success with public welfare, remains as pressing today as it was when James first demonstrated how individual ambition could be transformed into institutional influence that shapes the course of human history. These stories matter because they help us understand how individual decisions during historical crisis points can establish patterns that influence society for centuries afterward. The financial systems, political relationships, and social structures that James Rothschild helped create continue shaping our world today. Thanks for joining me on this historical journey. Until next time, keep questioning how the past explains the present.